So much going on with Syria. Now to discuss this further, we're joined by Laurie Lloyd. She's a world affairs commentator. Laurie, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you for doing this with us. Let's get started. Al-Assad's rule has come to an end after 5 decades. How do you think his departure will change the power dynamics in Syria and at large the Middle East?
And there is the question. It is 24 years of Bashar al-Assad, followed by 53 years for the entire dictatorial family. Of course, Bashar al-Assad was preceded by his father, Hafez al-Assad. Assad the Elder was thought to be a dictatorial, someone who had no problem putting down dissent in a violent way. And Bashar al-Assad, the son, who apparently was never meant to be president, his older brother who died in a car crash, was really the heir apparent, but he outdid his father in terms of taking up guns, taking up violence against his own people. 53 years. And in some of the footage that we have seen, we can see the utter joy amongst Syrians about the departure of this family that has not only stifled dissent, but has been kleptocratic, has taken money out of the economy. The younger al-Assads who have gone off over to Moscow are meant to have escaped with billions of dollars, thereby sort of drying up an economy that's really needed help. As for what comes next, and that was a long answer, I think, to get out of telling you that it's really unclear what comes next. And while there is relief about the departure of the al-Assads, there's a lot of worry about the HTS. This is the new faction that has led the military operation that got them to Syria, that completely rolled over the regime military. They are in the process right now of forming a new government, and what we're seeing now looks fairly orderly. The military leader of the HTS is issuing statements through his aides saying that we are talking about finding a new prime minister, forming a government. It's not clear whether this will be the prime minister who is right now still in office. The only resignation we've seen is of the president, but there are many, many fears. The HTS is one of only a number of factions that united simply to topple, united in a very loose way, simply to topple the Assads. They are not ideologically aligned at all. Now, the HTS has said we are promising inclusive government, but a lot of people are nervously waiting to see whether that will be the case. Don't forget, the HTS has its roots in a very extreme form of Islam. They once sympathized with al-Qaeda and with ISIS. The leader of the movement once expressed sympathy with the 9/11 bombers. He has now said that he wants to create inclusion. He has tried to disown those comments, but there is a lot of edginess about what kind of government will be formed. And I think without that inclusion that is being promised at the moment, it's difficult to see stability for Syria because there are so many other factions, some of which are backed by some very powerful countries.
Right. Laurie, I'm glad we're talking about inclusive government in Syria and the hopes for the return of millions of refugees, right? But let's also talk about the UN. It has called for accountability for the crimes committed under Assad's rule. How can Syria balance, holding people accountable with the need to move forward and rebuild the country? And can the Islamist rebel group be able to achieve that?
It's an excellent question. And I think to begin with, we do need to look for whether we see that inclusion that you so rightly mentioned, whether there would be reprisals against people who may be not supportive of this new government. There are certainly many representatives of the al-Assad's Alawite sect. It's an offshoot of the Shia branch of Islam. There are supporters that are still around. Will they be governed by this new government, if this new government can be formed? But this question of accountability, about 100,000 Syrians, perhaps more, were disappeared during the rule of al-Assad. Will they be found? Are they alive? What is the way of recovering them, getting word to their loved ones about their state? And put this against the waning credibility of the International Criminal Court. This may not, the International Criminal Court seems to have lost its way as being an apolitical body to hold dictators and people who misrule their countries to account. We look at the indictments that came down against Israel's leader. France and a number of other countries said, well, we may not observe that. And I'm sure you may be a little too young, but back in 2017, when South Africa refused to arrest the president of Sudan, who was visiting for a summit, who had been indicted by the International Criminal Court, it doesn't feel that this body is doing what it says on the label. And I think that may suggest that any sort of reconciliation may take the model of what happened in South Africa after the end of apartheid with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But I think given the state of the ICC, ideally, this sort of reconciliation would come internally.
Laurie, 2017 was my early 20s, or sorry, rather, it was my late 20s. So it's my late 20s. I look young, I know, but 2017 was my late 20s. Just so you know that I'm not a spring chicken. But let's throw China into this conversation, shall we? They have shown interest in Syria, and they want a political solution. How do you think China's growing influence in Syria will shape the country's future?
An interesting question. My sense at this moment is this would be one that China will very happily sit out. China is facing quite a severe economic slowdown at home. There's a little unrest, particularly among China's youth, where unemployment is quite high, kind of bubbling up a little bit. Satellite evidence and intelligence from the West seems to indicate that China lost a partially built submarine in a training accident not that long ago. So I think China may be looking at other things. I think, and this has the potential for ongoing mess. I don't think this is one that China will have an interest in. I think where I'm fascinated is what role does America tend to play, if at all? Now, incoming President Donald Trump has said, hey, this is not one for us. However, some of the existing State Department officials in the Biden administration are saying, if we let Syrians fill this for themselves, and if they're not successful, we leave a big vacuum where ISIS can reform. And there are other countries that have a big interest here. Turkey, for example, you mentioned those refugees. Turkey would like to see the return of some of those refugees, although that's a double-edged sword because Turkey gets a whole lot of money from the European Union to keep those refugees, and it gives them leverage over the European Union. But certainly there are interests there. Those interests are not necessarily consistent with America's interests, even though America and Turkey are part of the NATO organization. So the potential for continued strife and mess here is absolutely huge, and it feels difficult to say this with the departure of the Assads. Really is for ordinary Syrians should be very, very good news.
All right. Well, Laurie, many thanks for doing this with us. We appreciate you for the very insightful perspective and also just giving us more insight on what is to come for Syria in the next couple of days. All eyes now on Asia, on Syria, and also for the people in Syrians. Laurie is a world affairs commentator, just giving us a bit more analysis regarding Syria. Once again, thank you so much.